In this video, I'm going to show you guys my long-term experience with the Creality K1C, and in a previous video, we took a look at the regular K1, and in that video, I walked you guys through the unboxing, assembly, and setup of that machine, and these two printers are so similar in that regard that I'm going to skip over the assembly and setup process, and instead, I'll just show you guys the unboxing very briefly and highlight the differences between the two machines, and then we'll get right into printing. Now, of course, I would encourage you guys to watch this video from start to finish, as it is a long-term review and I've had the printer for a very long time. So you'll get to see my experience with this machine from the beginning all the way up until now. And spoiler alert, the prints are coming off a lot better now than they were at the beginning. And that's mainly due to the Creality Print 5.1, which is the latest release of Creality's slicer that's compatible with the K1C. But if you guys are in a hurry, you can use the YouTube chapters below to skip ahead to the section that's named Slicer, and from there you'll see the latest and most recent results with the printer.
And finally, before we get started, I want to thank SainSmart for sending me the K1C. I would not have been able to make this video without them. They're an official distributor of Creality products, including the K1C, and I'll put a link to that in the video description down below. First, we'll have a look at the unboxing, and although I'd previously done a video on the regular K1, we're going to find out here if there's anything included with the K1C that's different. In terms of the packaging, everything was packaged very nicely, and all of these surfaces, like those acrylic or glass panels that could be scratched, were covered with some kind of protective plastic coating. The only different thing included with the K1C was that carbon filter that I briefly flashed up on the screen. Otherwise, all of the accessories are the same as the K1, so I'm just going to fly through that and we'll move on to the unique features of the K1C versus the K1. The first being this carbon exhaust filter that I just mentioned, and it snaps into the back of the K1C. This could make a small impact on particulates and odors for certain materials, but we'll see. The second thing is on the lid, they now include this rubber strip. It's applied to the inner left side of the lid, and this is going to prevent the cable chain from slapping against that plastic cover and making an annoying noise. It has an adhesive backing, so it only takes a quick moment to install, and you can see when I place it on the top of the K1C, again, it's located on the inner left side, and I'm sure you can imagine when the cable chain is bent, that's where it's going to come in contact and dampen the noise. There's also now a built-in camera on the K1C, which was an optional upgrade on the regular K1. At the back of the K1C's build plate, you'll also find a nozzle cleaning brush. This assists with cleaning the nozzle before starting a print or probing the build plate. And you may also notice some aesthetic differences, such as the build platform itself now says K1C and shows the build volume. And it looks like Creality moved to some smaller pulleys on the XY motion system to address vertical fine artifacting. And if you venture through some of the touchscreen menus, you can now see time-lapse photography being enabled because of the camera, as well as some AI detection options that may detect failed prints with varying degrees of success. The K1C also has the latest gen extruder and hot end from Creality that the first gen K1 did not, and that should amount to less filament related issues such as jams and clogs. Now, one filament related thing that they do still have is the original spool holder, which I really do not like. The spools just drag along that plastic peg, and the location at the back of the printer is really inconvenient to get to. For those of you guys who've been following my channel, you'll know that I developed this universal spool stand, and it's compatible with a ton of Creality machines, and that includes the K1C. It's a low friction filament path solution that conveniently locates the spool at the top of the machine where it's easy to get to, and I'll be using that for the duration of this video. Now, to get started with our test prints, we do need to load in some filament, and SainSmart sent me some of their GT3 high-speed PLA. Got a few colors we can test, so I'm going to go with red to start. I'll load that into the universal spool stand and take the filament and route it through the PTFE tube at the back, and we'll get that in the extruder and we're ready to print. Now, I've had this machine for a really long time and I wanted to test it very thoroughly before releasing this video, so that means some of these original prints that I've done in this machine are so old that the slicer settings and the slicers themselves are now obsolete. Normally, I would be sharing that information with you, but in this case, I'm going to leave it out of this video just so I can cut down on the video time. But I still wanted to show you what these early prints look like because I'm sharing with you my experience with this machine from start to finish. This 7.5 hour Dragon print finished successfully, but it did require a lot of heavy supports around the mouth and the head. They were quite difficult to remove, and the surfaces that were printed entirely on the supports came out looking pretty rough. Now, this certainly wasn't the fault of the machine hardware, but rather some of those early slicer settings that I just mentioned are now obsolete. So I'm happy to say that's no longer a problem, and we'll touch on these supports a little bit later. But you can see here that during this support removal, I actually cracked the head partially off of the model, but otherwise the rest of the part looked pretty good, and all these small and fine details were captured. Early into my experience with the K1C, I was trying to print a lot of models that were very challenging for an FDM printer. For example, this design here had certain components that were printed entirely on top of support material. And the whole model did print successfully, but based on what I'd shown you in the previous example, you can imagine that the surfaces that were printed entirely on supports were fairly rough looking again. These surfaces would be hidden when the model is assembled in its multiple pieces, but this is something that a lot of early users may not have been happy with when they first got their K1C, and again, luckily this has been addressed since then. The rest of the model looked pretty good despite those early slicer settings not being optimal. There was a slight bit of stringing on some of these parts, although they were very fine wisps that could be easily blown away with a heat gun. I know PLA isn't nearly as bad as some other materials for absorbing moisture, but it could have been that this filament here had been sitting out in open air for probably a year now. In hindsight, I probably shouldn't have used it, knowing that this was going to be a print that would make it into the video, but I really wanted that green color for this particular character. Beyond that, all of the parts did fit together, so there were no issues in terms of dimensional accuracy. But one thing I did notice that was definitely off with some of these earlier slicer settings were these very small fine details at the top of his face that looked very melted and were likely impacted by perhaps the minimum layer time settings. But I was shocked to find, however, that all of his teeth were intact despite having his mouth filled mostly with support and the support material not being the easiest to remove. If you look really closely, there's obviously some room for improvement on this model, but it is a model that is pretty difficult to print on an FDM machine. So we'll go ahead and switch out that old filament, and things should only improve from here. I wanted to move away from some of those matte looking filaments for a moment, and instead I settled on this metallic blue PLA. I also wanted to demonstrate a less organic and more geometric shape, so we've got this spiral funnel here. And even with some of those older outdated slicer settings, it did come out looking fairly nice, although the one thing I wasn't happy with was the placement of all of these Z seams. And again, that's more of a slicer issue rather than the hardware, but it is a little unfortunate because I do find those seams very distracting from this otherwise very nice mesmerizing spiral pattern. The repeating pattern that you're seeing on some of the outer surfaces is very present in the 3D model. The STL has this exact pattern of facets that make up the surfaces and faces on this spiral vortex. I'll put a link to this file in the video description so you can go out and see that for yourself. So it doesn't appear to be an artifact that's being produced by the printer or any of its hardware such as the motion system. All other aspects of this print turned out looking very nice, and I'm a big fan of that spiral vortex pattern. And speaking of patterns, sometimes you do want a repetitive pattern on some of your prints, and to do that, we can use some of these pattern build plates. They become very popular this year. Now, they do not have that nozzle wiper on them. However, it seems to work just fine without that, and they are double-sided. One side has the traditional gold PEI textured surface, and the other side has a micro textured surface that gets transferred to the first layer of your print. There's a whole bunch of different designs and patterns available. This one here is one of my favorite. And I find that the only catch to these is that you have to raise the print bed temperature about 5 to 10 degrees higher than what you normally would use to get the same level of adhesion that you would see on a normal PEI surface. You can find a nice variety of these plates on my website, embracemaking.com. I've got models that fit the K1, K1C, K1 Max, as well as other Creality models like the V3, V3 Plus, and of course other brands outside of the Creality lineup. It's a great way to add some extra flair to your 3D prints and at the same time support this channel. Now back to some print examples on the K1C. I'm going to be using one of these carbon fiber pattern build plates, and we're going to be printing one of these snap latch cases with some black carbon fiber PLA. I don't see it anywhere on the official product page, but apparently the C in K1C stands for carbon, and the nozzle that the machine comes with is suitable for printing abrasive materials. With the exception of that little blob on the top solid surface of this model on the left hand side, this part came out looking excellent. Carbon fiber filaments are personally some of my favorite filaments to print in. They tend to hide a lot of imperfections, more so than regular matte filaments, and there's something a little bit extra or special about the surface sheen on the carbon filled filaments. There's no significant ghosting or ringing on the outer walls of this part, and the carbon fiber build plate transferred that pattern perfectly to the first layer. For the snap latch case build, it did require some custom inserts, and I decided to print those in this glittering PLA gold. I thought this part here came out particularly nice. You can see there are absolutely no flaws in this part on that top solid surface, and the walls were looking extremely smooth. I didn't see any signs of the vertical fine artifacts that were a common complaint on the original K1. However, the walls on this part were fairly thin, and you can see some impression of one of the walls that meets this face on the other side. And under some lighting conditions, there's a tiny wood grain-like finish that runs along the part horizontally. I also had this corner of the part lift because there really wasn't much material stuck to the print bed in this case. So I'd probably redesign this part with some thicker walls and more material to stick down on those corners, but otherwise a very respectable looking part. After that, I went on to print the latch and hinges and used one of my laser engravers to laser engrave the logo right on top of the case. Added some foam on the underside of the lid, and then placed all of my wireless microphones and my lavalier mic inside of the case. So you can see how these individual parts coming off the K1C came together to make a tidy little case, and I'll put a link to that in the video description down below. So that's where I'll cut off those early print examples from what I'm seeing now with the latest version of Creality Print. And this is Creality Print 5.1. It was released a few months ago, and it appears to be largely based on Orca Slicer. They've modified the layout quite a bit, but if you're familiar with Orca Slicer and you dig into Creality Print 5.1, pretty much all of these same options are there, just in different places. On the right hand side is where you'll find all of your material presets along with your print parameters, and you can toggle between some basic settings as well as all of the advanced settings. And again, all of these settings are very similar to what you'll find inside of Orca Slicer. But the nice thing here is that after testing these various profiles across different machines, not just the K1C, Creality really seems to have nailed it with their profiles now. I've mainly been playing around with the PLA and PETG profiles, and we'll get to PETG a little bit later in this video, but I've had to change almost nothing in order to get some really nice looking prints out of Creality Print 5.1. I find myself only changing typically the nozzle temperature depending on the brand of PLA or PETG that I'm using, as well as the number of wall loops, the infill density, and the infill type, and that's just more to control the strength of the print rather than the quality. Every once in a while you get notifications for machine profile updates, which you can accept or reject, and when I've accepted them, I've noticed very minor tweaks, but at the time of this video release, it seems like they've got these profiles dialed in nicely. So hopefully now you guys can see with the latest slicer settings what the K1C is actually capable of. It's actually really a shame that they didn't have the slicers dialed in this well when they first released the machine, especially the K1, as it was their new flagship machine, because there's a pretty stark difference between what you're seeing here and what I was showing you with my earlier experience with this 3D printer. This particular part has almost no blemishes. The top solid surfaces are excellent and very smooth, as well as the outside perimeters being uniform and smooth as well. The K1C also laid down the first layer on this print quite nice on a textured build plate. There was only one very small area where you could find a blemish on that first layer, and that's really the only part of this print where I could point out some kind of obvious flaw. So now let's shift back to some more complicated prints using Creality Print 5.1. And this time I've got this Captain America bust, and when you import the model, it looks like the designer intended for it to be printed like this in this particular orientation. And if I go ahead and slice it without any supports, we can identify areas that are going to be potentially problematic, highlighted in blue. If you're pretty experienced with printing, you could probably just identify them with your eyes, but the blue areas are going to show you which areas are exceeding the overhang threshold. And so I'll just take note of those areas, and then I'll use the buttons up at the top of the screen to switch back into the prepare mode. And then I can make some quick adjustments to the print parameters. For example, I'll change the wall loops to 2, as well as the infill pattern to support cubic. And I'll also change the sparse infill density to 12%. And these settings here are being changed in order to save a little bit of filament. And then I can click on the model and we can get into support painting in order to address those overhang areas. And one thing to take note of here is that the support settings in this support painting window do not transfer over or seem to affect the global settings for supports that you'll find in the menu on the right hand side. So basically, if you enable supports in this support painting window, do not expect these supports to be enabled globally on the print settings on the right hand side. They're completely independent of one another. And so I'm going to go ahead and paint on supports on all of those regions where I feel they're going to need the supports. And you can see that I've enabled the tree supports. And this is not at all a functional model, so you can also see in the print preview that the infill density is very sparse at best. And now that I'm happy with the print settings, it's time to send the file wirelessly over to the K1C. I currently don't have it in my device list. And so I'm going to add it to the device list by going into the device tab, manually adding a printer, finding its IP address, which is in the network tab on the touch screen of the printer, and then I can just type that in and it will auto recognize the K1C. And this is another thing that I find Creality Print 5.1 does very well, is connect to all of the Creality printers flawlessly. Last time I checked, and I could be wrong, but if you still want to connect some of your Creality printers to other slicers such as Orca Slicer wirelessly, you will have to root the printer, and this is not something I've done yet with the K1C. And I'll be honest, previously I did find that very annoying because I did want to use Orca Slicer with the K1C, but now that Creality Print 5.1 has improved so much, it doesn't bother me. And I haven't rooted the printer yet because I'm using Creality Print 5.1 for all of my Creality printers, and there's just zero issue with the wireless connection now. And so you can see here that I've sent the file off to the printer with one-click print, and the camera view within the device tab is going to give us a preview of the print starting. Then we're going to have a quick look at the time-lapse of a drama-free print and the final result. I was super impressed with the details around his face, especially again around his lips, nose, eyes, and portions of his mask. And unlike some of those earlier models that I showed you where the support was very difficult to remove and left some pretty nasty looking surfaces, the new support settings in Creality Print 5.1 make those supports much easier to remove and leave cleaner surfaces. The flat walls around the arms of the bust came out looking very smooth, no signs of any sort of vertical artifacting. A lot of the fine details like the stippling in his suit were captured. On the area of the star and his upper chest, those were printed upright, so you do get the effect of the layers stacking up, which doesn't look the best. But that's pretty normal for FDM printing unless you go to a very fine layer resolution. And on the side of his face, you might think that surface looks a little bit strange right around his ear. But that wavy kind of looking texture was actually in the model itself. And so it's important to note that when your model has these very fine textures or patterns on the surfaces, they're likely going to come out in the print, but when they're that fine and that small, they may not be perfectly replicated, and they could actually look like some kind of print artifact on the perimeter walls. So when you switch back to the printed model, what you're seeing in some areas may start to make a lot more sense. And now with the bust portion of the model out of the way, we need to print the base, and for this, we're back in Creality Print 5.1, and this is a much simpler print, so I didn't really have to make any adjustments other than the number of wall loops as well as the infill density and the type of the infill pattern. And this time I went with a tri-hexagon pattern, as I wanted this part to be slightly stronger because it does have to hold up the bust, and I'm just personally not a fan of support cubic or adaptive cubic infill for any part that requires any amount of strength. And for this part here, I switched back to the SainSmart matte red PLA, as I'm trying to achieve a very obvious red, white, and blue theme here for Captain America. And currently the K1C is not a multicolor printer, although it does look like Creality does have multicolor, multi-material support coming in the near future, which the K1C will be a supported machine. So that's an interesting development to watch out for, and in the meantime, we're left with manually coloring our prints in post-processing. Taking a look now at the finished product of this shield-shaped model, you can really see how great this part looks in matte red. The perimeter walls are looking flawless, and the top solid surface layers are looking very smooth and uniform. I was having a real hard time finding an issue with this print, so if you guys think that I'm crazy and you see something wrong with it, feel free to leave a comment in the comment section down below. And let me know what you guys think, but to me it seems obvious that these newer prints with Creality Print 5.1 are leaps and bounds better than the prints that I showed you earlier in the video with previous versions of the Creality Slicer. Putting the two pieces together, I think this is a very impressive looking model. If you guys are wondering how I colored the star and certain aspects of his helmet, those were just done with a silver Sharpie. I'll put a link to this model in the video description down below. Now we're on to PETG, which is a material that I have a love-hate relationship with. I really like its mechanical properties, but on a lot of machines I do hate printing with it because it tends to stick to the nozzle, and there's just more of an opportunity for failed prints than generally there is with PLA. I also typically find that the material presets for PETG never quite work out for me in these profiles that come with certain machines, but let's see how this turns out with Creality Print 5.1. So I've got the generic PETG selected. They also have an option for the Creality PETG, but I'm just using a local brand, and it actually seems like the two settings, the generic PETG and the Creality PETG, there's almost no differences between the two. But I'm going to use the generic PETG. I'm going to go into the settings, and the only things I'm going to change are I'm going to increase the bed temperature a few degrees, and I'm also going to increase the nozzle temperature pretty significantly because I do know that the PETG that I'm using does require quite a high nozzle temperature. The only other settings that I'm going to touch here are the wall loops. I'm going to increase those to 4. I'm also going to increase the infill density to 20% and use a triangle infill pattern because I do need this part to be very strong. Otherwise, I'm going to leave all of the other presets as is. Occasionally, I do bump up the Z offset, but normally what I do is I start one print first, make sure that the material is not sticking to the nozzle and the first layer is going down nice and smooth without any sort of over extrusion or without squishing the PETG too much, because it does tend to like to be printed slightly farther away from the bed than PLA. But so far with the K1C, I've found that I haven't had to do that. I haven't had to increase the Z offset. And you can see when I angle the camera down here, there is no material sticking to the nozzle. It's going to be a very clean print when this thing finishes. And that's a huge plus for me because not having a material dependent Z offset is just one less thing to worry about every time you're slicing for a new material, as it's something easy to forget about. Looking now at the final results, you can see a pretty stark difference between the glossy finish of this PETG printed at a very elevated temperature versus some of the previous examples using a more matte finish PLA. The glossy color and the white finish under this direct lighting does make the part look rougher than it actually is. So I'm really not doing the machine any favors by using this material, but it is what it is. I needed this particular color for the application, as well as the properties of PETG, including its UV resistance, because this part is going to see some outdoor duties. But despite these small bumps and layer lines looking amplified in this color and this gloss finish, I was very happy with the way this part turned out. You can see on the first layer that there was absolutely no lifting or curling of the PETG, and I didn't have any material sticking to the nozzle, then getting deposited onto the model in random spots, resulting in blobs. Now I needed to print another model in the exact same material, so I brought in this part here, and this part requires some supports under those counterboard holes. I painted on these supports in that section, and I've enabled supports in the settings on the right hand side, and you'll see here that when I scroll through the layers, you'll see that there were some automatic supports added under the lettering. Now most of you guys are probably already aware of this, but for the 3D printing beginners out there, you can actually add support blockers. So if you go back to prepare and you click on the model and you go back into support painting, you can use the right click button to highlight the areas where you do not want support. Those regions will get highlighted in red, and that will indicate again that the support will not be added to those areas, it will block them. After I did that, I sent the model over to the printer wirelessly, and here is the finished result. You can see that as soon as I removed the model from the print bed, one of the supports came off and it was stuck to the print bed, so they were very easy to remove. However, with PETG, I was finding that even with Creality Print 5.1, the material that was printed on top of the supports was pretty rough looking. And that was not the experience that I had with PLA, so perhaps some of the support settings do need to be tweaked a little bit in the PETG profile. Otherwise, the rest of the part looked very good, and that part had a pretty generous amount of flat surface on top, and the top solid layer looked nice and even for a PETG print. And the final model that I have here is a pen and digital caliper holder for my desk, and I selected this model specifically because of the overhang at the back of the model. I wanted to see how this would turn out in PETG, and plus at the back there's also a fairly flat section, and I've reduced the infill to save a bit of material, so I want to see how the PETG will bridge over top of that sparse infill. And in the final part, I was not disappointed with how those two features turned out, but what I did find a little bit odd was on those flat walls, there was most certainly a repeating pattern vertically. It It looks a lot like some of the results that I've seen users post online with the original K1, but I don't at all see this when I print in regular PLA. So perhaps it's still there, just very faint, and maybe you can only see it when you're printing in a very, very high gloss material. And that's not something that I typically do because I find the higher gloss materials tend to look very cheap and plasticky. So it's not really a concern for me, but if you guys do happen to favor the high gloss stuff, then maybe that's something you should consider. But if it is mechanical properties that you're after, I've got no complaints here. These parts are very strong and I've had no issues with layer delamination either.
So that brings us to the review section of this video. And the K1C has been a very reliable machine for me for months now, and I actually have more than one of them running in my print farm, so I do have several data points to draw from. One thing to consider is that I'm particularly hard on these machines. So I do demand a lot of them and I log a lot of hours on them in my print farm, and the regular K1 lasted just over a year in this environment before it gave out, and right now it's receiving some upgrades. And the two K1Cs, one of them has given me no issues at all, and the other one did at some point have a defective heater cartridge, which I've replaced, and then put that printer quickly back into service. And the prints have only improved over time, as you guys have seen in this video. And that brings me to my next talking point, which is the slicer. So that improvement in quality, as I showed you guys, was mainly due to the new slicer profiles coming from Creality themselves in Creality Print 5.1. And while I think it's great that Creality has provided these awesome profiles for us to use, in the same way, I also think it's a little bit of a shame that it took them so long to do so. They're still a very dominant and recognizable brand in the 3D printing market, probably still one of the biggest. However, if they had focused on making that aspect of 3D printing easier for beginners, there'd be a lot more fanfare around these machines, and they would have retained a lot more of their market base from the beginning. But the good news is that if you're a beginner and you're new to 3D printing, or you're new to just Creality in general, then you won't have some of those memories from the past that will taint your new experience. One of the things I like about the K1C is that Creality stuck to making small changes to the K1 to get to the K1C. One of the old bad habits of Creality of the past was to completely redesign the machines every few months, and you can see that in the history of the Ender 3 lineup. Sometimes the Ender 3s would go forwards and make leaps and bounds ahead, and sometimes there would be aspects of those machines that would inexplicably go backwards. It felt like there was a lack of continuity between those models, and it just made things confusing in my opinion. I have heard some people complain that there wasn't enough change to go from the K1 to the K1C, but personally I do think Creality got it right this time. They addressed issues that people were complaining about. So for example, they improved that situation with the VFA, and also they improved the situation with the extruder as well as the hot end on the original K1. Those have been through at least I think 2 revisions now, and they seem to be performing a lot better. So those are nice functional changes that you can trace back from the K1, and it logically makes sense. They also made some other minor improvements, like adding the camera that I showed you guys, as well as addressing the rattling door, as well as the cable chain slapping against the lid. And these are just small changes, but they do add up to a better user experience, as now the machine feels a lot more refined and quiet. Ultimately, the question then is the higher price worth it? Well, that's up to you and whether or not it's in your budget, but I definitely would spring for the K1C over the regular K1. Going forward, I'm very excited to see how Creality is going to integrate their multicolor, multi-material solution that we've seen previewed on the K2 into the K1C. And I'm hoping to get my hands on one of those and share with you guys my experience on that in the future. So if you're interested in seeing that, please don't forget to subscribe to this channel. And don't forget to support the sponsor of this video, SainSmart. They sent me the K1C to make this video, and I'm gonna put a link in the video description where you can find the K1C on their website. They are an official distributor of Creality products, so definitely go check them out. And if you guys enjoyed this video and enjoy my very thorough content, be sure to support me and my channel by visiting my website, embracemaking.com, where you'll find lots of different upgrades and accessories that you've seen in this video that are for the K1C, as well as many other Creality machines, plus other brands. So go check that out, like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video.